The Norwegian Method.
I'm Olav Alexander Boo, peak human performance developer, coach to Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Iden.
I'm Dr. David Lippman, a health and human performance specialist, and welcome to the Norwegian Method podcast.
The Norwegian Method.
Welcome back to the Norwegian Method podcast. Joining me today, Olav, welcome.
Thank you, David, as always.
Yeah, and we are talking heat and altitude today. So two things that you've done tons with. You're probably almost synonymous with you and the boys is, both the heat training and then certainly lots of time at altitude. I think Sierra Nevada's probably a place you spent more time than your own bed at some point. So I think what's going to be really interesting today, I mean, we've had conversations about both these things separately that we ended up putting on the Centaur Tech Clubhouse, but I think we'll probably rehash a little bit of the basics, but a lot of it's going to be about how we use these throughout a year and how they interact, because I think that's quite interesting. Because for those unfamiliar, when you go to altitude, you end up with a hemoglobin mass increase followed by a plasma volume expansion as a result. Whereas it's almost the other way around with heat. You have a plasma volume expansion that then potentially influences hemoglobin mass as a result. So they're almost conflicting in some respects, even though they're synergistic over a longer term time frame. So just wanted to shape that all up or outline that all before we started. But thinking about this, how do you periodize these two things throughout a year? So let's start with altitude. That's probably the easier one, and then we can talk about heat.
Yes. Where to start? It's a big topic, and it's I think that there are many things around altitude that still is misunderstood for people that are adopting it and so on. I think one of the things that gets a lot of credit, or that what people focus on when they think about altitude and heat, is exactly what you bring forward: hemoglobin mass and plasma volume. However, coming back to first principles, I think in the first season, like we talked about, it's not really about hemoglobin mass and plasma volume. Those are more, let's say, effects or a consequence of going to altitude. And you can say that in isolated studies where we study or when we measure the changes in plasma volume and hemoglobin mass, of course, it's easy to explain that plasma volume has a positive impact on both thermoregulation, but it also has a very important, or also a very important actually influence on cardiac output as well, or stroke volume, depending on how you quantify stroke volume. Hemoglobin mass also on the other side is what carries the oxygen around in your body. But you can say that this is a little bit, to give an analogy, hemoglobin and plasma volume are to some extent a little bit, or actually let's take plasma volume away from the connection with cardiac output. But the point here is that we know that hemoglobin mass, roughly speaking, 1 gram of hemoglobin increase in hemoglobin mass, and then we can come back to the hemoglobin concentration and why that's you can't use that, but hemoglobin mass. So if you add 1 gram of hemoglobin mass to your body, that means that you have the potential to transport, or you have a capacity to transport 1.34 milliliter extra of oxygen around in the body. That has to do with just how the molecule is built up and how it connects the oxygen molecules to it. However, this is in the same debate, or there's a discussion when we talk about power. There, you can say, if you focus only on torque, like say you put torque part of the equation, there's still no power without cadence. So torque without cadence is no power. 200 in cadence but no torque means also still no power. So you need a mixture of both of them. And when you go to altitude, you can say that the analogy we can use is that you're really, let's say, increasing the torque part of the equation. So that means that hemoglobin or plasma volume is, you could say, a little bit the torque part in the equation of oxygen or VO2, and cardiac output is the cadence part of the equation. what happens when you go to altitude is that you will get less naturally stress on, let's say, the cadence part or the cardiac output part, because you can't go with equally high muscular load on the body. So the metabolic load will probably stay pretty much the same, depending a little bit how you prioritize, but around the same things. But you won't be able to go as hard, let's say, from a purely power perspective, or basically the muscular part, how much power, force you are able to produce over time. And that means that you get also less stress on the cardiac output, or let's say the system that represents the cardiac output. So basically your heart, so high heart frequency, but also the stroke volume part of it. So because well, there are of course programs where they do try to bridge this in, and more of this, you can, of course, some people say live high, train low, and to try to mitigate this. I would say that live high, train high, and then rather be better at prioritizing. Because if you try to, I would say, and that's to getting into the core of it then, because we very often think about when we go to altitude, say it's about hemoglobin mass, so it's about plasma volume when we do heat. In reality, we are actually just looking for better performance. That's ultimately what we are looking at. You could a little bit bluntly say, I don't care even if your hemoglobin mass goes down up altitude, as long as you just go faster at races. But however, if you measure this, you want to understand why is hemoglobin mass going up and what is then causing the better performance in races for you when you come back to altitude. And then the next question would be, is it then possible to both keep that, what obviously then contributes, let's say, proportionally more to performance, offsetting the loss that you have in hemoglobin mass there, and now suddenly you can rather compound them instead, build acute. That's why we also want to do measurements, because we want to understand how do the body react to something, and then better adjust the stimulus so that we can get the best compromise to get the best out in races moving forward. And this is basically what I can say. It comes down to experience with an athlete over time, and that's where also a little bit of individualization comes in. But this means also that there are so many things, because when we also start talking about physiology, like in terms of hemoglobin mass or plasma volume, or we talk about muscle fiber types or mitochondria, whatever that is the thing that people like to talk about, it's a very reductionistic language in many ways that is really hard to prove. Can you really say that now that you become faster because your type 2 fibers really have improved or whatever, or you become more economical because you have trained more your type 1 fibers? It's a place where one very easily just jumps to conclusion, and one starts actually trying to figure out, how can I better understand this without necessarily using very invasive methods, other things, or what actually becomes very unprecise language because you can't prove it. So even though it sounds like a very precise language, it becomes very unprecise because you have nothing to document for. You worst case end up thinking that sounds like a very cool explanation, and you stick to that one, and you lose out on what really is the reason why things are changing. And that's why I think it is super important to always stick with tools that are simple, easy to implement, that are based on first principle. Like if you go for let's say, take an engineering approach, velocity is the king. In the one end, we have power meter, which is basically the engine, and you're looking at how much work the engine can do. And of course, with power and velocity, you can look at the work economy, basically how much of that power are you able to translate into forward motion, which is key. And the lower power you can actually go for the same velocity, the better it is, because on one side, then you can go either decide to increase the power and go faster, or basically going lower power if you can do that while compromising your top end power, but velocity stays the same. It means normally also less heat, less energy demand, and so on. But ultimately, this starts with an input. An input in the races is what we quantify with indirect calorimetry. So if you have, for example, a VO2 master and you have a GPS on the other side, you basically have what is really needed to have an input-output system to evaluate whatever goes on in between there. And you can just say, okay, this seems to work better because it either moves the input side of the equation, or it moves the output side of the equation here. And that gives you an idea of efficiency, but it also gives you an idea of potential as well. Focusing too much on hemoglobin mass and plasma and so on, or thinking that that's the reason why you go to altitude alone, that will not necessarily set you up for better performance. They are good indicators, but you might lose out on other valuable things. And as again, we talked about this before, but measuring inputs, VO2 master, measuring out or lactate outputs, power and velocity, that gives you, let's say, the most valuable tools you can really have if you integrate them well in your training moving forward. And then basically, I've seen athletes coming down from altitude with actually reduced hemoglobin mass, but still a higher VO2 max. And you can say, how is that possible? Well, basically, most likely because cardiac output have gone up more than the reduction in hemoglobin mass. There can also be other explanations as well. But the point is that we have to be open for that. People adapt in different ways to altitude. But of course, we want to see, for example, we know that increasing hemoglobin mass is good. We know increasing plasma volume is good. One thing to be cautious a little bit about when you go to altitude is actually you get a drop in plasma volume when you go to altitude. So you get a significant drop in plasma volume, at least in your blood. There are a couple of theories around where it goes. Can be due to diffusion in the body, so it actually starts pulling up other places in the body. But we also know that there is a reduction also very often in fluid, total fluid mass in the body as well when you go into altitude the first week before it gradually starts to come up and normalize again. However, how do we prioritize? Because that's the how do we prioritize? How do we bring this into a training plan? That's the question. We already said that altitude and heat normally brings down the muscular load or the load on your joints, bones, muscles, and so on. The benefit of this is that you can then, for example, say, hey, early in the season, when we are starting then to bring in training again, that's a good time of the year to bring in altitude because it allows you to, on the one side, bring in the volume and so on. You keep a little bit higher metabolic stress for the body, but you keep, let's say, the part of the intensity that typically can cause injuries lower. So you get a softer start on the muscles, joints, bones, and so on when we starting with altitude training early in the season. Then typically there are many different ways for how people like to use altitude. Some people like to use altitude all the way into races. This depends again on what kind of race you're going to do. Is it a one-day race? Is it a multi, like in cycling, for example, a Grand Tour? Is it a high intensity? Is it a low intensity? High intensity being, for example, like a 1500 meter, or low intensity being more like an Ironman, for example. Obviously, both of them goes to exhaustion, but in different ways. Even though one is high intensity, one is low intensity, but if you have a low intensity event like an Ironman, then you can say that what you can do up at altitude will probably be very much the same as what you're going to do in a race. If you do a high intensity event, like for example 100 meter swimming, or you do 1500, 400, or 800, 1500 meter running, for example, or even 5K running, then the intensity is going to be so high that you will be further away from your competition speed. And that means that also then after these kind of events, some people prefer to have a block at sea level between when they finish their stay at altitude, to be able to go higher at race speed and start already tapping into, for example, then the benefits that they have gotten from being at altitude, so that when they come into races, they have also more specific load in their body. And then hopefully you are having a compound effect there where you both get the benefits of what you got at altitude, plus the benefits of what you now built at sea level before the race. There are many studies, for example, that was done several decades ago on looking at the hemoglobin mass kinetics and performance, and obviously it's well documented over decades that, for example, when you come back down from altitude, you will normally see a drop in hemoglobin mass, and then after, let's say, 3 to 4 weeks, it depending on a little bit what you do, it will be back ballparkish where it was before you went to altitude. However, this is not always true. With very good programs, we can actually maintain this also after altitude for long periods, even until the next time we go back up to altitude, but it depends on what the program is. Without overcomplicating this, I would think of altitude and heat more as tools. It's tools in a coach toolbox. And the tools, they are so that you can keep or you can increase the metabolic demand for the same velocity, or you can maintain the same metabolic demand, but at a lower velocity or power output. And that shifts the load proportionally more over on the metabolic system when you are at altitude, and lowering the load on the muscles. And if you then see there is a part of the season where you want to give the athlete a little bit more, let's say, rest, or a little bit less load on the peripheral system, the muscular system, and so on, then altitude is a brilliant time to put that in there. And then when you need to start to build more the high intensity part of it, that's when you go back to sea level again and you focus on that. Same thing is actually with heat as well. Heat is no different. It's really just a tool in the toolbox that shifts the load in the body. Let's say when you start exposing the body, and then at some point, of course, you're getting back to where more or less the load is balanced out again. Peripheral and central load on the body is pretty much the same. And that means that then you also have to question how much longer do you really want to stay at altitude when you have come to that point there. Are there more to be gained? And I would say you are at least then pushing. You can stabilize a little bit, but again, it's probably better to go down and do something else, provide a new stimulus or different stimulus to the body. And why does this work? It's simply because, again, we don't have surgical precision. We don't have surgical precision in what we do. Of course, we probably have been pushing that part to get closer to a part where we get better and better precision in what we do, so we can scale the volume of our programs more. But I would say that we just know that the body adapts to a stimulus, and some parts of the body adapts faster, other parts of the body adapts slower. We can just look at bones versus cardiovascular system versus muscles, for example. They adapt very, very differently to a stimulus. Bones needs, best case or worst case, years to adapt to a stimulus. Cardiovascular system, months. Muscular system, weeks to adapt to a stimulus. And that means that, for example, some of the times we actually even have to hold back, because if we measure something maybe only by lactate and you're in a really good block, you can increase so quickly sometimes on LT1 and LT2 that we just know that we actually need to hold back, because the chances for injury is too high, because the rest of the body is not able to keep up with it. And this is why. But do we know 100%? No, because we can't bring a person into an MRI machine and a DEXA machine and whatever machines all the time, do muscles biopsies or whatever that we think that we want to have, or that we're talking about. And that means that a shift in stimulus is throughout the year, block periodization this throughout the year, and then repeating this. Don't underestimate the value of repetition and the recognition effect that sits in the body and the mind with actually repeating a pattern as well. This is still to date and invented or said far before I came into sports, that this is something that we just see is working empirically. And of course, we're trying to increase the precision and do things with more better or more innovative and these kind of things. But I think sometimes it's also easy to get a little bit ahead of oneself, and one of the ways to do that is to become imprecise in the language, but starting to talk about things that you actually don't measure, and putting the course on that. So To round up the heat and altitude. Heat and altitude, there are basically two tools in the coach's toolbox to shift the load from peripheral to central system. You can even talk about cold here as well. It doesn't have to be hot; it can also be cold, for example, as a stimulus. That's one. But shifting the load between metabolic and or central and peripheral system. So central system being heart, lungs, blood, so on, and peripheral system being your musculoskeletal system. So, for example, your thighs and legs and arms, shoulders, whatever there. And I would also say that, again, yes, increase in plasma volume and hemoglobin mass, they are linked to studies demonstrating that this can improve or be the reason for why you get an increase in performance. Like we talked about, 1 gram of increase in hemoglobin mass equates to 1.34 milliliter extra of oxygen potentially transport, or at least bound to the blood. 1 extra milliliter of plasma means basically that you potentially can increase your cardiac or stroke volume by 0.7 milliliters extra. So again, they are potential reasons for why you can improve, but I would rather say that think of it more practical of basically what is the effect. What is the measurable effect on the body when you use these tools? Heat, for example, mechanical load will have to come down. If you lock it to a certain lactate or oxygen uptake or heart rate, core temperature, then basically what you'll see is that power output will go down quite significantly if you use heat. And then as you go, you will see the body starting to adapt to this. And for the body to adapt to this, there has to be something happening somewhere in the body that adapts to it. And plasma is one of them. That's not all, is one of them. Same with also with altitude. When you go to altitude, there are different stimuluses or different things that we can measure that is happening. It's actually not only hemoglobin mass that normally increases when you go to altitude, but very often, because when you have more climbing hours on the bike when you go to altitude, you'll also see actually the utilization goes up for an athlete as well. That, of course, means that that's not good for everybody, but for a certain type of athlete, that is good. So again, it's about what do you want to do for the athlete and how can you do it in a way that really keeps the athlete motivated, where they get a shift in load, it doesn't become too monotonic.
The Norwegian method.
The reason why I use Morten with the boys is because it reduces the GI stress. And the reason why it reduces the GI stress is basically because carbohydrates are packed in a hydrogel. And why that is important again is because if you can then take more carbohydrates per time, it means basically also you can train faster or race faster, which ultimately is the goal in our sport.
To benefit from the one-time code and get 20% off your next purchase on Morten.com, simply enter the code TNMS1 at checkout. The code is applicable once per customer on all products except the Morten bicarb system, valid until the 31st of December 2025.
The Norwegian method.
But I think that's helpful because people, it fuels all my biases firstly, which is like big picture thinking, big picture view on it. And I've been thinking a lot about ways in which we can dissociate what is otherwise a relationship we think as 1:1 of peripheral to central adaptations, right? And there are many means to do this, as you've mentioned already. Heat and altitude are one. A couple of quick questions on this to clarify, because I think this could be misconstrued a little bit, because somebody's now dealing with a tendon pathology or a muscular issue, and they go, okay, I should go to altitude now because I can keep training as hard, but reduce the load on this. And I think maybe heat is a solution in that context, but I would say altitude probably isn't because of the increased energy expenditure. How does that sit with you?
No, I think you are fairly spot on there. I think I would never recommend anybody to go to altitude with an injury or sickness. I would, again, because of the increased metabolic demand. And what we have to remember is that the body is always fighting for resources. And if you then have a sickness or injury that the body needs to deal with, and you basically now the body has to fight for survival almost up at altitude because there's less oxygen available in the air and a higher metabolic demand. That means less, worst case, goes to repairing your injury or the sickness, or even worse, you get adverse effects from it, where basically you get a reduction in performance because it has to break down parts of it. It's not. It's we have spent so much time at altitude using gold standard measurements to quantify changes in plasma volume, hemoglobin mass, oxygen uptake, efficiency, and so on for athletes, first principle or close as first principle as possible. And one of the things we do see, and we've seen many times before, if you get sick or injured or anything, and you go to altitude, you will most likely actually see a reduction in hemoglobin mass for your athletes. I think also further that thinking that heat is call it a cheap strategy to increase your hemoglobin mass and you will perform better. I know there are studies on this, but it's just starting at the wrong end. Heat is a tool in the same way as anything else in your toolbox, and it shifts a load. Put it this way: if you had the same program throughout the whole year, you did the same training every day, all year round, you would very quickly stagnate. Why don't you stagnate? Well, because you most likely follow some kind of periodization or microcycle. So in that microcycle, you have harder days, easier days, and so on. And those days which is harder can be higher intensity, but it can also be longer. So they basically target different, or they challenge the body in different ways. Then you can say, well, if we just keep the same microcycle then the whole year round, yeah, well, maybe you go a little bit longer before you stagnate, but you will also stagnate then as well. So periodizing your year into different blocks, for example, a macrocycle, having a 2-3 macrocycles a year is actually what I would say very good, because it allows you to have changes and reset a little bit and come back. And even though you lose maybe a little bit from having a break or taking it easier in a period there, you will bounce back even stronger every time you do this moving forward. And that's why it is, to avoid that you stagnate, periodization, variations is important in the program. And heat and altitude is a component or tools in that kind of, let's say, changing the stimulus or changing the load on the body to avoid stagnation. But it's not because of plasma volume. It's not because of hemoglobin mass. They are factors. They are factors in, of course, in the picture. But there are other components. There are other things here that really are more important, and we haven't even touched upon psychology, even talking about it. So it's again, sound periodization where one understands the athlete's needs. What, of course, on the one side, physiologically, what do we want, or physically, what do we want of performance in a race? How can you bridge this in? Looking at, okay, is it a high intensity event? Okay, then you want to probably have that in your specialization pair, more high intensity. You want the altitude block a little bit further away. If it's a longer race, more where you do more endurance, these kind of things, the intensity is not going to be very high. Well, okay, then you can move heat, then you can move an altitude block closer in to races. But then again, I'm going to complicate it, unfortunately, a little bit more. And it also depends on what kind of periodization you use. Some people like traditional periodization, some like reverse periodization. There are so many ways to really do this, that altitude, heat, many of these things, there's no one way of doing it. There are multiple ways of doing it. But that's why we come back to then what I think we talked about in the first season or second season, and that is that specificity is king on the one side. And then the question is, yeah, but you should only do specificity. And no, absolutely not. But you need to understand specificity. And then basically periodization is about breaking that, let's say, chopping that elephant into, let's say, edible pieces, and then spreading it out where you think they can build together, or how to put it together in order to arrive at the starting line as prepared as possible. And if you do specificity early in the season and then you do something completely different close to the race, then you can probably have a good physics or physiological reason for that. But from a mental or psychological perspective, having specificity close into a race and you really feel that, oh, I'm strong, I'm really performing now, that part that part is heavily undervalued, leading into races. So again, specificity. I'll give a very quick example. To build your LT2, for example, you can do that multiple ways. You can, of course, just train your LT2 and you will see it comes up. But the question is, okay, how much does it come up? Another way of doing it is actually to train above your LT2. Not much, but slightly above your LT2. So obviously now your lactate is unsteady and these kind of things, but you can still, how to say, you can still do a lot of work there, but which lifts the ceiling of your LT2. But then also, a little bit later in the week, you have another session, and then you go a little bit lower in altitude, but you go longer than what you're capable of doing at altitude session. What you'll see when you bridge this together is that you will probably see more progress in altitude over time, combined, of course, with steady state session around altitude. But shifting between these is where basically there will be happening adaptations that we are not talking about, or we don't have full control over, compared to if you just say that, okay, you need LT2 and you think that's the only stimulus that you really need. And that's the same thing with specificity. If the Ironman is basically where you see, yes, there are some surges, but average speed is mostly around this place, for example, or weighted average speed is a little bit around this place, for example, then it's about training a little bit above, with higher intensity, but shorter sessions. Train some sessions lower intensity, but then maybe that goes longer, for example, than what you would normally do in your specific sessions. And these combined is what gives the better result. And then you can say, when you have a block, for example, let's say that you also spread into a larger block, and you say that now I'm going to work a little bit more on my low intensity part, well, then altitude can be a really good tool. Heat can be a really good tool, but don't think of heat as a way of increasing your hemoglobin mass. Even though there are studies saying that, yes, you do that, but it's not necessarily the reason for why your athlete perform better. There are other reasons also that are equally important to it.
Yeah, and then you've sort of hinted at this before, like the individual variation between individuals, right? And that's just an experience thing, unfortunately. There's no shortcut to that. And that'll impact your periodization as well. Because I know we talked previously about coming down from altitude and going up to altitude, and the difference between, say, Christian and Gustav, and the difference in their adaptation timelines and what they need coming down and going up to altitude. And those are different, despite the fact that they probably have the most similar training for the longest period of time compared to any other athlete. So that's then an individual factor, not just a training factor, right? It's not that they're two different athletes that have been trained differently. It's that they've been trained similarly and they're different. So I think that's great sort of insight there. Obviously a little bit different to how I thought the conversation would go, but I think that's the value here, is that it's not as linear as people think. It's probably not quite like the textbook, because you've got experience, right? That's what we're here for, is for that. So thinking about heat as a stimulus, because one thing is, as opposed to altitude where you can, we talked about the injury already, where you can't remove it. You can remove heat, right? You go into the heat, or you create a heat stimulus and you can leave it, which is helpful from a 24-hour energy expenditure standpoint. But it also creates different questions around dosing, right? Because you can now dose it properly. So how do you think about dosing heat as a stimulus? Is it something you do easy sessions only, or do you do it in harder sessions as well? How frequently are you doing it in a block of heat? How would you think about that?
I would approach it very much the same way you approach altitude as well. And I would not, let's say my recommendation would be, and we why have we landed on this? Well, it's because people recommended, or my mentor, Örjan Madsen, of course, worked with altitude for a long, long time. So I got some shoulders to stand on. But we, of course, took this a step further to look into even more into periodization, doing more measurements as well, to really try to get a better understanding of what's really going on here. What are the adaptations, or at least more of the adaptations that are happening, and to see if we could control them even better. Altitude, we normally start with that. We actually bring down the load a little bit before we go to altitude, and then we actually ramp up the load gradually after we come to altitude over the 3 to 4 weeks we stay at altitude. And then you can say that normally, depending on your 3 or 4 weeks, but then you will actually be doing more or less the same also peripheral intensity, or basically the same power output as you would do at same pace running, same pace swimming, same power output as you actually would do swimming, biking, cycling at sea level, because you've adapted. So the metabolic load and actually the peripheral load, or the central and peripheral system, actually have reached almost an equilibrium again due to adaptation.
Is that general or is that specific to the boys?
No, that's general.
Okay.
That's that. Although you can say that the consequence of going to altitude is the body actually obviously senses that it actually is a higher cost, and it will try to mitigate that by, for example, increasing hemoglobin mass in the body.
Gotcha.
But you could say that for heat, it's pretty much the same. I would, depending on what you want to do with heat, but I would, or the way we use heat is that we bring in heat the same way. We bring in heat by starting first off with lower intensity sessions, extending it, and then gradually bringing it up also on the higher intensities as well. But what you'll normally see here is that you reach adaptation there much quicker than what you do for altitude. And that's also when we normally then just take off the heat again. It doesn't make sense to really do heat all year round, because that's a little bit like we talked about. It will lead to, of course, yes, a better performance, but you're not necessarily the full potential that you can get from heat by block periodization, periodizing it.
Yeah, okay, that makes some sense there, and it's somewhat counter to how most people use heat and how most people talk about heat. They talk about doing a block leading into something and then doing maintenance sessions. So, do you use heat to prepare for altitude at all, or do you think that's probably misguided?
No, again, it's a little bit the question, and it's in those groups where this has been discussed. It's very often because people become too much physiologically oriented. They see, okay, if we can now do a little bit of heat before we bring up plasma volume, we will offset a little bit the drop in plasma volume when we first come to altitude. We will come in with maybe a little bit more, let's say, pre-adaptation, because we will get a little bit more, let's say, stimulus to increase hemoglobin mass before we go there, and so on. However, I think it's a little bit where it becomes too reductionistic, and people don't really understand the mechanism behind why these adaptations really are happening. They, of course, want to start to talk about it really doesn't matter. The point is that it's a place where you start over focusing on physiology and not performance. You focus more on hematology than performance, and it's not about hematology. Nobody's going to give you a gold medal for having the highest hemoglobin mass in the world unless you perform. People really don't care. It's purely a tool to basically try to drive performance.
The Norwegian method.
The reason why you want to have a VO2 master, because when athletes or customers comes there and they are doing the training, they're putting in money and hours into improving the fitness, you want to have a device that basically allows you to track their progress, but also measuring their metabolic power as well. And then on top of that, the only way to truly be able to do individualization is also to measure the utilization of the athletes. And there is probably no better device on the market to do that with than, for example, the VO2 master.
If you've been thinking about adding VO2 testing to your training facility, you know our viewers get an exclusive one-on-one consultation with their product experts on how to make VO2 Master work for you. Head to vo2master.com/Norwegian-method to book yours today, or follow the link in our show notes.
The Norwegian method.
Well, the answer is physiology, and your point's well made, which is if you're limited by calories and you want to go in with a bit of a surplus to allow better adaptation, then it's probably, unless you have a reason to try and reduce peripheral load and can't get to altitude early, it doesn't make a great deal of sense because it's going to cost you.
That's one. And the second thing is also that I think we always want to keep the body as much as possible in homeostasis while focusing on performance, because it allows us potentially to go even harder. Because the moment you start to offset homeostasis too much, this is when you will start to become limited, or the, let's say, time to exhaustion becomes shorter and shorter. And this is not only on a single workout perspective. We have to remember that we are also very often too much focused on a single session perspective, or single interval perspective. Most people are beyond that. They focus on single session. and they forget that it's not a single session that basically makes you better. It's the consistency of the time. We have said this so many times before. And that means also in this case as well that there can be sometimes you want to try to mitigate a change in the body. But we have also seen that, for example, if there was a big debate, for example, around antioxidants, should we eat a lot of antioxidants, for example, to reduce inflammation in the body and so on? And then some people start debating this and want to figure out, well, maybe that's not so good, because the reason for why we have inflammation in our body after exercise is because we actually have done exercise. And then for the body to understand that it needs to adapt to this, it needs the signal. It needs that signal. And the more powerful the signal is, the greater normally the adaptation is as well. So if you then start then to mitigate that or try to intervene with that signal by feeding in antioxidants, or for example, if you do hot, cold or cryotherapy or other things like this to try to reduce it, the problem with that is that you're reducing the signal which you actually want. You could actually just really put it bluntly, you could rather just train easier so that you get the same signal, so you don't have to do it. But that's not what you want. You really want to be able to train hard so that you get the signal. But what we have to remember, and then as well, is again, we have different parts in the body, and we might actually manipulate one part of the system and not other parts of the system by trying to intervene with it. And we have to remember that the body is so smart that there's a reason for why things are happening. And if, for example, let's say that there are also conversation around using bicarb before you go to altitude to buffer up more fluids or plasma volume in your body before you go to altitude. But again, it's a little bit like, what is the consequence of it? Why do the body reduce the plasma volume when you go to up to altitude? Is it just a stupid consequence of the body is unsmart? No, there are probably a very smart reason for why this is happening. And again, the more we go in and we try to artificially intervene with the body's natural reactions, we are also getting into a domain where things becomes even more complex or complicated, because we can't necessarily trust the outcome of the dose that we're providing anymore either. It becomes harder to reproduce because we don't know how things will be down the road. So again, it's where I would say that natural adaptation always first, because it's the most reliable and the easiest probably to reproduce over time and for the body to recognize and so on. The more stuff we add, we have to remember, heat training doesn't come for free. Altitude training doesn't come for free. Bicarb protocols doesn't come for free. Whatever thing, antioxidant, whatever you do that basically adds one more routine to your day or change to your day, that has a consequence not only physiologically but also psychologically as well. We talk about fatigue, just to an off topic and a little bit more philosophical, but to keep it very short. That is that 20 years ago, we did around 2,000 decisions. What is basically what people went through each day. Think about it, 2,000 decisions. Think, I'm not doing 2,000 decisions. Yes, you are. Every time you consider whether you're gonna do something with your hair, or you're gonna do something with your shirt, or you pick the red or the yellow shirt, or you just open up a drawer to pick a fork or a knife there, and you have two different sets of them there. You are making a decision, but you are making unconscious decisions. Where to look, your thoughts, what are you thinking? There are so many decisions that are made that are unconscious. The problem is that today, this is basically 6,000 to 7,000 decisions a day. Why? Because of these devices. You're sitting there scrolling through things. And the thing is that you can't just add things to an athlete's program. Basically taking a step from world class to world champion level, it's about taking away. And then say, hey, but how is that possible? Probably from when you started as a novice or as an amateur and you went up to world class level, you added. But what did you add? You started with a bike, probably. Then you got a power meter, or maybe you got first a computer and a heart rate monitor. Then you got a power meter. So more added, more routines, more instructions, all the things around that, how to eat, how to track, all these kind of things. The point is that on that journey there, you've probably added so many things because you're looking, and as you should do, you're looking for a competitive advantage for how to get faster. But at some point, you have to sit down and evaluate what actually makes a difference to my performance and what does not. And basically, the concept then is to take away as much as possible until it affects performance. And then you add in just that again there. And then when you want to add in new stuff, it has to be because you believe that that thing you add in there is going to have to replace something, but it will be better than what you replace in your program. That's how you're taking the steps again. So it's almost like a diamond shape. It starts with there and it grows up like this until a certain level. And then basically from world class up to world champion, it's about removing noise, and so on. And that's why some of the best environments, they are very protective of their environment. It's not about secrecy. It's about that they know that noise is one of the biggest threats to performance at the very top there because of all the demands that are there when it comes to recovery, training, focus, purpose, all the things that are there. So heat, altitude, all these kind of things that is there, you have to have a purpose with it where basically it comes in and it replaces something in your program, making that part better. It cannot be added on top. So you can't add all things on top. For example, people that wants to do altitude and heat combined, we have done many studies on this. And it's basically one of the things where the consequence of this is that you're shifting an even greater load on the metabolic system compared to the central system. So the offset is even larger. And it will be even longer before you are able to adapt to that or basically bring adaptation up there. And that's why, there are different camps. I would normally not advise using both heat and altitude combined unless there is a really good reason for it.
Yeah, I think it's salient. The best example here, talking back to the sort of diamond analogy or the diamond discussion you had, is there are many age groupers, probably some listening, who do as many hours as some of the pros. The difference is the pros spend a lot more time doing nothing. They actually rest more. So it's more about adaptation, because remembering it's not what you can do, it's what you can adapt to. And so it's super important to remember that. A couple more shorter questions, perhaps. How do you dose heat appropriately? You don't really have an option to dose altitude. You're kind of at altitude or you aren't, and you can choose heights and whatever else. But like heat, you can dose, right? So is there a way that you think about dosing heat specifically?
You can say you can also, of course, there are people that are using hypoxic tent and so on.
Sure.
Again, I think we will not cover that simply because we don't use it. And the reason why we don't use it is because we actually don't get necessarily the benefits out of it that people hope to get out of it. If you use tools like hemoglobin concentration and other things like this, it might look good. But if you start to do hemoglobin mass testing with these athletes, you don't necessarily are able to document the same benefits of hypoxia as you do with altitude. But then you can also ask, why is that? Well, again, it's about intensity and duration. And it's much harder to get intensity in a hypoxic environment than it is in a hypobaric environment. And at the same time, also, the duration is also much harder to get in a tent than it really is when just living at altitude. Because at altitude, you can be out, you can have a walk, you can go to the shop, whatever it is, have your bike ride, sit out in the sun and enjoy, relax, whatever. And then you have the exposure. If you live in an altitude tent or a small confined area, you will basically you won't be able to stay in that for the same duration. So it means that either you need to bring up the intensity, which will have other, let's say, side effects, or you need the duration to be much longer than what you would have in a natural environment. Heat, same thing. Depending on what kind of adaptation you're looking for. If you're looking for basically reducing the muscular load, it's just about bringing in just enough heat that you are able to get the mechanical load that you are comfortable with. But in other situations, it means also that if you really are preparing for the hottest race of your life and you just need the best performance that is there, then it's about bringing in enough intensity and volume of heat to be able to have even a surplus coming in there. So it means maybe worst case, even more heat and duration than what you will face in the competition you're going to do.
And I assume for you, heat is always an active situation. There's not much passive heat because it doesn't make a lot of contextual sense.
No, well, it depends. We also do use, depending again on the need, but we also use passive heat, but not passive heat, where we use hot tubs and other things like this. It's more about the frequency of it. So, for example, we can use passive heat in a way that the boys, for example, just dress up more. They take on clothing, and wear them for an hour. So they just sweat a little bit more, gets a little bit uncomfortable, but sweating a little bit more. And then it's off and it's natural. And then they maybe do a heat session, for example, running or whatever, where they have a little bit more. But then they're off again. And then maybe a little bit later in the evening, for example, when they're eating dinner or whatever, then they bring on clothing or whatever again, to really so that it becomes uncomfortably, not like crazy, but uncomfortably warm, there where you start to feel that you're sweating and other things again on your body. We know that we're getting, when we quantify this as plasma, we see that we are able to drive plasma quite quick up, and have very good plasma volume expansion. But again, it's a little bit where you then, of course, add more. So the question is then, what do you take out? Or do you just add it as an extra load to your athletes when you do it? Because this is, of course, much more psychologically demanding. So you have to be, when you go into specialization, for example, then you can go into an overload period, which is not sustainable. It's not sustainable. But you can do that for a period because you know that you're going to taper next going into a race. So you're building that little bit extra that is there. The same thing you can also, of course, do here with heat as well, that you can decide to bring in a little bit overload, both physiologically and mentally, with heater. But it has to be then with the goal that you're taking that away again because you're tapering into something where you get them the benefits of it, but you can't continue it for long extended periods. So again, the thing is that I know everybody that probably are listening all wants to have the quick fix. Everybody wants to have the quick fix. We have to remember that the reason for why we are where we are is that it took us 15 years to get where we are today. It was not something we did overnight. It happened as a part where we did start to systematically, methodologically, already in 2017. I think that the very first athlete I actually started to do heat with was actually one of the guys in the Olympic group in the triathlon team, Jørgen Gundersen. And he was actually the athlete that normally really suffered the hardest when he came into heat. Him and also Kasper, and actually Christian as well. But Jørgen was in particular really suffering when going. So after 2015-16, research basically looking for, let's say, not going necessarily through just research paper, but actually looking at it more from where do we see this almost in if we wanted to do biomimicry, what kind of animals or humans are living in extreme heat, and how do they actually, what have they developed in order to deal with this? And especially if you look at them at humans that do live and hunt even in the middle of the sun, why do they even do this? And you start to learn a little bit from, there are different perspectives there. Military, for example, where ethics and moral doesn't exist. It's more like if you are out and you just have to get out of the field in the middle of the sun, in the middle of the day. It's not like you say, hey guys, this is not ethical now, it's too hot, we have to cease fire here. It doesn't work that way. You just have to get out and you have to be adopted for it. And that's the same thing also in races. Races ultimately are kind of a war in the end. It's not about who goes or tries to be most ethical or moral. It's just who dares to race the hardest and actually get away with it in the end.
So you're talking about sort of when you initially started researching heat and how you learned.
Yeah. So Jørgen actually, he when we started to bring this this program and it was typical a 10-day program, 7 to 10-day program. After that, he started to have almost same performance in hot conditions as he had in cold conditions. He even had his best 5K run ever in warm condition after we started to implement the protocols. And then, of course, starting to scale into the team. But we have to remember that the reason for why we have gotten where we are is that we started systematically, methodologically, had an idea, we started to test it out failing fast, trying to fail fast, but in a way where we all were aligned and in a direction that we thought this can be a competitive advantage. And then here we are today. And we have, of course, have learned so much along the road that if I were to give advice to people that have not used heat before, I would say take a period, for example, in the beginning of the season, where you're going to keep things low intensity and all things like this, because it's also a recognition effect. It's not only the physiological effect, it's also the psychological effect. Start with it in the early of the season and start not with both heat and altitude. Start with one of them. And for example, heat is a low-cost option, low risk, low-cost option to start with. Start with there, bring it in on some sessions, start playing around with a little bit more longer duration on the easier sessions, see a little bit how things are there, and don't change too many other things. Just do the low intensity. And then see a little bit how the athlete responds to this by tracking core temperature, power, and of course, for example, heart rate, lactate, and so on. But let's say core temperature and power, for example. And then the goal is exactly that you want to see is that for the same core temperature, power obviously drops very much in the beginning in the heat session, but then you start to see it come up. But you have to be mindful about don't change the heat. So you bring up the heat more and more and more. Just go with one heat stimulus and then keep that heat stimulus and then learn how they adapt to it. So if you normally do, you start the season with easy training and this kind of thing. Now, next season, starting probably very soon for you, take that opportunity now for a month where you bring in 2 weeks of where you take one particular type of sessions you have, the lower intensity part, bring in heat there, do it indoors in a controlled environment. So normal room with just a heat oven there that you preheat for an hour before. You got your computer or your temperature sensor that you can look on. And then basically you start to see, okay, this is the temperature in the room. This is the core temperature before we start. This is the power output we do, for example, and then see how this changes over a period of a month. And then basically in that period of that month, you don't need that in the future, but it's more just to be able to see when it actually really comes up and when it starts to stabilize. Don't be tempted to add in more. Just do this for now because it will set you up far better to do the next steps afterwards. And then you learn basically how quickly this is happening, what happens when you add duration to it, not intensity to it, but again, keep changing as few variables as possible, and then actually afterwards take away the heat and start doing it in normal condition, and you start to see probably better performance than what you've done before. But that means now keep the heat away from a period before you introduce. So go back down more to normal training for a period, and then you can bring it back in again. The whole point is that what you've done this season, what you want to do for next season is just do it a little bit better. And doing it a little bit better means basically not changing a lot of things that you're doing. It means basically introducing one thing, and if that is heat in this case, bring in heat control at a very, let's say, low risk part of the period, and it will be better. And if you get a little bit better there, you will most likely be able to carry this all the way throughout the year, even if you take away the heat stimulus, because you just started off on a better foot this year than what you did previous year.
I love that. That's a great way to end this episode, Olav. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time as always. I wanted to give a quick note to people. We have a Q&A episodes coming up, so we would love some questions. Please DM them to us at the Centaura Tech on Instagram. That'll be the easiest way to get them to us. So we'll collect those and ask some of them on Q&A episode with Olav upcoming. Other than that, please do like the podcast, share this with a friend, and subscribe if you haven't yet subscribed. Until then, until next time, we will see you later. Thanks so much, Olav.
Thank you.
The Norwegian method.